Chapter 1. The Official Theory. The phrase blank slate is a loose translation of the medieval Latin term tabula rasa, meaning a scraped tablet. While the specific words belong to history, the metaphor is most famously associated with the philosopher John Locke, who likened the human mind to white paper, void of all characters and ideas until experience furnishes it with the materials of reason and knowledge. This empiricist vision was originally wielded as a potent weapon against the dogmas of the era. By denying the existence of innate ideas, Locke dismantled the justifications for the divine right of kings and the unquestioned authority of the Church. If no one is born with inherent wisdom or divine mandate, then hereditary royalty and aristocracy lose their foundational legitimacy. Slavery, too, becomes morally indefensible when the enslaved can no longer be viewed as innately inferior. Instead, differences in human thought and status are recognized as the products of divergent experiences and histories, fostering a philosophy of tolerance and the democratic ideal that social arrangements should be built on mutual consent. Over the past century, this doctrine has evolved from a philosophical argument into the guiding framework for the social sciences and humanities. Psychology dedicated itself to explaining all behavior through a handful of simple learning mechanisms, while the social sciences sought to interpret every custom and social structure as the inevitable result of socialization. The mind was viewed as an empty vessel filled by the surrounding culture, a complex matrix of words, images, role models, and systems of reward and punishment. Concepts that seem intuitive to human perception, such as emotions, the division of sexes, and family ties, were increasingly declared to be social constructions. The blank slate transformed into a sacred political and ethical scripture. It decreed that any disparities among individuals, races, or sexes arise entirely from differences in their environments. It held the optimistic promise that by reforming education, parenting, and media, one could wholly reshape the individual, eradicating underachievement and antisocial behavior through the sheer power of enlightened social engineering. Accompanying the blank slate is a second foundational doctrine famously linked to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but predating him: the concept of the noble savage. This perspective suggests that humanity in its natural primitive state is inherently peaceable, selfless, and untroubled. According to this romantic vision, the blights of modern existence, greed, violence, anxiety, and subjugation, are entirely the artifacts of civilization. Rousseau argued that early humans lived in an idyllic balance, and that the institution of society, with its laws and property, was the fatal accident that corrupted our inherent goodness. This stands in stark contrast to the grim assessment of Thomas Hobbes, who envisioned the state of nature as a brutal war of every man against every man, a miserable existence where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, the only escape from this natural hell was the surrender of personal autonomy to a powerful sovereign, a leviathan capable of imposing peace through awe and authority. The debate between the noble and the nasty savage has profound implications. If humans are inherently noble, a domineering state is not only unnecessary but actively destructive, generating the very strife it claims to manage. Child-rearing, in this view, becomes a process of nurturing a child's natural potential, and any emergence of evil is blamed on the corrupting influence of society. Conversely, if humans are naturally aggressive, child-rearing must be a disciplined effort to tame a dark nature, and a strong police force becomes the only bulwark against chaos. The spirit of the noble savage courses strongly through contemporary culture, manifesting in a deep respect for all things deemed natural, from food to childbirth, and a pervasive distrust of authoritarian structures, alongside the comforting belief that our social problems are merely repairable flaws in our institutions, rather than tragic inevitabilities of the human condition. The third pillar of this intellectual trinity is the ghost in the machine, a concept rooted in the dualism of René Descartes. Confronted with the rising mechanical view of the universe, Descartes drew a sharp boundary between the physical body and the immaterial mind. He argued that while the body is a mechanical entity extended in space and subject to the rigid laws of physics, the mind, the thinking self, is entirely indivisible, unextended, and capable of free choice. This doctrine offered a profound moral comfort. It rescued human dignity from the cold, deterministic machinery of the physical universe. If humans were merely complex clockwork driven by chemical and physical reactions, then life might seem stripped of higher purpose, and concepts like free will and moral responsibility would evaporate. A machine cannot be held accountable for its actions, but a freely choosing soul can. These three doctrines, Empiricism, romanticism, and dualism, though logically distinct, frequently march together. A blank slate naturally invites a ghost to take up residence, as an empty mind requires an immaterial driver to read the dials and pull the levers of the physical body. Furthermore, a ghost free from mechanical causation perfectly accommodates the noble savage. When bad behavior occurs, it can be attributed to the freely choosing ghost or the corrupting environment, shielding the underlying biological machine from any accusation of inherent defect. Together, these philosophical tenets have deeply infiltrated modern consciousness. They shape everything from our metaphors of childhood as a blank book waiting to be written, to our romanticized views of indigenous peoples living in perfect harmony with nature, to grave political and medical debates that hinge on identifying the precise moment an immaterial soul enters a cluster of developing cells. Chapter 2. Silly Putty. At the dawn of the 20th century, the intellectual landscape was heavily burdened by overt prejudices cloaked in the language of science and scholarship. Prominent thinkers casually advanced theories that equated the phonetic structures of foreign languages with racial indolence or effeminacy, and exalted their own cultures as the pinnacle of virility and logic. Imperialism, nationalism, and the lingering shadows of slavery made ethnic and racial divisions starkly visible. Darwin's theory of evolution was frequently warped into social Darwinism, misapplied to justify the dominance of wealthy classes and powerful nations as the natural survival of the fittest. The non-white races were often depicted as mere rungs on an evolutionary ladder, and the biological inferiority of women was treated as an established scientific fact. This era birthed the eugenics movement, leading to horrific policies of forced sterilization and ultimately providing the ideological scaffolding for the genocides of the Holocaust. In the wake of these atrocities, and alongside massive waves of immigration and social mobility, a profound moral and intellectual revulsion took hold. Mainstream intellectual life in Western democracies systematically expelled the casual bigotry of the past. To ensure that such oppressive ideologies could never again find scientific sanctuary, the theories of human behavior were radically refashioned. The resulting consensus, often termed the standard social science model, was driven by a noble and urgent desire to establish a social order where innate biological forces played absolutely no role in accounting for the behavior of different social groups. The blank slate was entrenched as the ultimate safeguard of equality. In psychology, this transformation was spearheaded by the rise of behaviorism. Building on the associationist philosophies of the Enlightenment, thinkers like John B. Watson declared that the mind contained no inherent talents, penchants, or abilities. Psychology was stripped of subjective concepts like thoughts, instincts, and desires, focusing entirely on observable behavior and its modification through environmental conditioning. A child was viewed as a completely malleable entity capable of being molded into any profession or character, given the precise manipulation of stimuli and responses. The rich instinctual psychology of earlier eras was discarded. Even fundamental human drives were redefined as mere conditioned reflexes. Human beings were equated with laboratory animals, their behaviors shaped inexorably by the contingencies of reward and punishment in their environment. This vision promised a utopian future where social engineering could eliminate aggression and inequality, turning society into a perfectly calibrated mechanism of behavioral control. Concurrently, the other social sciences underwent a similar revolution, fundamentally altering the concept of culture. Franz Boas, challenging the racist hierarchies of his time, demonstrated that differences among human groups were not biological but cultural. He proved that the languages and practices of indigenous peoples were as complex and functional as those of European civilizations. However, the subsequent generation of anthropologists and sociologists expanded this crucial moral insight into an absolute dogma. They insisted that all aspects of human existence must be explained solely in terms of culture, and that culture itself was a super-organic phenomenon, an autonomous stream of events floating entirely free from the biological realities of individual human minds. The individual was diminished to a tiny, insignificant component of a vast socio-cultural system. In this new paradigm, human nature was described as an unbelievably malleable raw material, akin to putty waiting to be stamped and molded by the overwhelming force of cultural traditions. Beliefs, values, and even the deepest emotions were entirely manufactured products of society. The mind was no longer a complex biological organ, but a screen upon which culture projected its patterns. This complete severing of human behavior from biology was accompanied by an ardent revival of the noble savage, portraying pre-state societies as bastions of peace and universal brotherhood, and fueling an unending optimism that humanity could be entirely remade for the better. The ghost in the machine was also quietly preserved, providing a mechanism of free will that allowed society to consciously direct its own cultural evolution, liberated from the deterministic shackles of biology. Yet, this absolute separation of human behavior from the natural world created a bizarre intellectual architecture. The mind was treated as a phenomenon exempt from the laws of biology and evolution, existing in a parallel universe defined only by historical events and cultural conditioning. The triumph of the standard social science model succeeded in combating the pernicious racial theories of the past, but it did so by constructing an artificial and ultimately fragile wall between the study of humanity and the study of the natural world. Chapter 3. The Last Wall to Fall. Historically, human understanding has been compartmentalized by conceptual walls, barriers that rigidly separated different realms of existence. The first great wall to fall was the divide between the terrestrial and the celestial, breached when it was discovered that the same physical forces governing a falling apple also hold the moon in its orbit. Another wall crumbled when the deep past was unified with the present, revealing that ancient geological landscapes were carved by the very same forces of erosion and tectonic movement visible today. Eventually, the formidable boundary between the living and the non-living collapsed under the weight of modern biology, which demonstrated that life is not animated by a mystical essence but by universally applicable laws of chemistry and physics. Yet, one massive wall remains stubbornly guarded in the intellectual landscape. The partition dividing matter from mind, biology from culture, and the natural sciences from the humanities. This division is the very foundation of the official theory of human nature, protecting the blank slate, preserving the nobility of the savage, and harboring the ghost in the machine. Today, however, new ideas from 4 distinct frontiers of knowledge are systematically dismantling this final wall. The first bridge connecting biology to culture is the cognitive revolution. For millennia, the gap between physical events and mental intentions seemed unbridgeable. How could a physical hunk of matter possess beliefs, desires, or reasons? Cognitive science grounded the mental world in the physical world through the concepts of information, computation, and feedback. Beliefs and memories are now understood as information residing in physical patterns of brain activity. Thinking and planning are systematic transformations of those patterns, much like the operation of a computational program. Desires and tries are feedback loops, adjusting behavior to reduce the discrepancy between a current state and a goal. This computational theory of mind fundamentally alters our understanding of human malleability. A blank slate, quite simply, cannot do anything. An inert, empty surface cannot recognize patterns, learn language, or interpret the intentions of others. Learning requires complex, innate machinery to process the incoming data. Furthermore, cognitive science reveals that an infinite range of behavior can be generated by a finite set of combinatorial programs in the mind. Just as a grammar system uses a finite set of rules to generate an endless array of novel sentences, mental software generates boundless thoughts and actions. Beneath the superficial variations of global cultures lie universal mental mechanisms. Different societies may have different triggers for anger or different rules for polite expressions, but the underlying psychological programs, the capacity for outrage or the desire for social status, remain uniform. The mind is not a homogeneous, easily molded lump of clay, but a modular system of specialized interacting parts. The second bridge is neuroscience, the hypothesis that all subjective experience, every thought, emotion, and memory is ultimately the physiological activity of the tissues of the brain is no longer speculative. When brain tissue is altered by injury, chemicals, or electrical stimulation, the mind itself changes. The tragic case of Phineas Gage, whose personality morphed from responsible to reckless after a frontal lobe injury, demonstrated that moral reasoning and social behavior are rooted in physical anatomy. Cognitive neuroscience has even begun to map the illusion of the unified self, showing that the brain operates through multiple, sometimes conflicting supervisory systems rather than a single commanding ghost. Moreover, the physical structure of the brain is not a blank slate waiting for the environment to shape it. The basic geometry of the cerebral cortex, the wiring of its lobes, and the distribution of its gray matter are largely established before birth. The third bridge connecting matter to mind is behavioral genetics. The potential for thought and emotion that distinguishes humanity from the rest of the animal kingdom is encoded in our DNA. Small genetic differences can yield profound behavioral disparities. Many cognitive and emotional traits, spanning intelligence, personality, and predispositions to mental illness, have been shown to be highly heritable. Studies of identical twins separated at birth consistently reveal striking similarities in their temperaments, political attitudes, and even minor idiosyncrasies. Genetic variation does not mean that behavior is rigidly predetermined, as environments play a crucial role in how traits manifest. However, the influence of genes severely damages the doctrine of the blank slate. The mind cannot be completely devoid of structure if genetic variations can systematically alter its cognitive and emotional functioning. The fourth and final bridge is evolutionary psychology. The complex design of the human mind, like the intricate engineering of the eye or the heart, is a product of natural selection. Cognitive and emotional faculties evolved because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce in a challenging environment. This evolutionary perspective distinguishes between the ultimate causes of behavior, the adaptive rationale that led a trait to evolve, and the proximate causes, the immediate feelings and desires that drive us in real time. We eat because we enjoy the taste of food, a proximate desire, but that desire exists because our ancestors needed nutrition to survive, the ultimate cause. Evolutionary psychology also forces a difficult reckoning with the doctrine of the noble savage. A completely peaceful and noble organism is an unlikely product of the unforgiving competition of natural selection. Ethnographic and archaeological data confirm that violence, warfare, and cruelty were pervasive in prehistoric and pre-state societies, often resulting in casualty rates that dwarf modern conflicts. Acknowledging this dark evolutionary heritage does not mean humans are inherently bloodthirsty or doomed to endless war. We are equally endowed with evolved faculties for cooperation, sympathy, and conflict resolution. Understanding the evolutionary roots of our behavior simply means recognizing that both our cooperative virtues and our aggressive vices are intrinsic parts of a complex, evolved human nature. Chapter 4. Culture Vultures. Human cultures often appear to possess a monstrous, almost arbitrary variety, leading to the assumption that culture is an autonomous entity, disconnected from human biology, descending upon passive individuals like the rules of an inexplicable lottery. From unusual dietary taboos to extreme bodily modifications, the apparent caprice of social norms fuels the belief that the mind is a blank slate inscribed by a free-floating cultural environment. However, culture is not a mysterious miasma. It is a part of the human phenotype, a natural emergence from our existence as a knowledge-using, cooperative species. To bridge the gap between biology and culture, one must recognize that acquiring culture requires highly sophisticated innate neural circuitry. Cultural transmission relies on a profound psychological feat, reading the minds of others. When a child learns from a parent, they are not merely acting as a passive video camera, blindly recording and mimicking physical movements. True imitation requires an intuitive psychology, an ability to infer the unstated goals and intentions behind an action. Artificial intelligence struggles to replicate this. Robots cannot easily discern which parts of a human's action are intentional and which are accidental. Chimpanzees may mimic motions, but they often fail to grasp the underlying functional intent. Individuals with autism, a neurological condition affecting the ability to read mental states, face profound difficulties in cultural learning. The fact that neurologically normal infants effortlessly read intentions before they imitate demonstrates that our capacity to absorb culture is hardwired. But why are humans so driven to absorb the culture around them? The human urge to conform, often dismissed as a mindless herd mentality, actually serves two vital rationales. The first is informational. By pooling the hard-won discoveries of past and present generations, a cooperative group becomes vastly more intelligent than any isolated individual. A culture's practices regarding tool-making, foraging, and social organization represent accumulated local wisdom, essential solutions to the ecological and reproductive challenges of a specific environment. The second rationale for conformity is normative. Many cultural practices are arbitrary in their specific form, but not in their function. There is no inherent reason why a society should drive on the right side of the road rather than the left, but it is absolutely critical that everyone agrees to drive on the same side. Shared conventions, rituals, and symbols coordinate behavior and resolve ambiguities. They delineate fuzzy boundaries, such as the transition from childhood to adulthood or the shifting of allegiances, allowing society to function smoothly. When these conventions are widely adopted, they create a social reality. Things like money, the rule of law, and political authority are objectively real within a society, but their reality depends entirely on the collective psychological agreement of the individuals within that group. Culture is essentially the epidemiology of mental representations, the contagious spread of useful ideas and coordinating practices from person to person. Viewing culture as a practical tool for living demystifies the dramatic differences among human societies. When populations separate geographically, their accumulated innovations and conventions naturally diverge, much like the branching of biological species. Furthermore, recognizing culture as an accumulation of technologies and social agreements allows us to understand why some civilizations historically achieved greater material success than others, without resorting to the discredited racial theories of the past. As historians and physiologists have demonstrated, the unequal fates of human societies were largely dictated by geography and ecology. The massive, contiguous east-west landmass of Eurasia acted as an enormous catchment area, allowing diverse populations to share and synthesize agricultural and technological breakthroughs. In contrast, populations isolated by oceans, impassable mountains, or north-south climatic barriers were cut off from this global network of innovation, forcing them to rely solely on local ingenuity. The conquerors of history were not biologically superior, they were simply the beneficiaries of a vast, interconnected cultural pooling. Connecting the cultural level of analysis to the psychological and biological levels does not lead to a destructive reductionism where history and art are ground down into meaningless discussions of neurons and genes. Instead, it offers a hierarchical unification of knowledge. A phenomenon like language can be understood simultaneously as an evolutionary adaptation, a neurobiological process, a cognitive computation, and a vast, shifting cultural system. No single level of analysis can replace the others, but neither can any be fully understood in isolation. By opening the black boxes of society and culture and examining the psychological machinery inside, we do not diminish the richness of the human experience. We simply replace the illusion of an empty slate with the profound reality of a complex, elegantly designed mind. Chapter 5. The Slate's Last Stand. ह्यूमन नेचर की साइंटिफिक इन्वेस्टिगेशन इस बात की गारंटी देती है कि नए डिस्कवरीज के साथ हमारी समझ लगातार इवॉल्व होती रहेगी। कभी कभी रिसर्च से ये पता चलता है कि हमने माइंड के इनेट स्ट्रक्चर को कुछ ज्यादा ही अहमियत दे दी है, जबकि दूसरे केसेस में ये साबित होता है कि हमने यूज काफी कमान का है। हमारे न्यूरोलॉजिकल सिस्टम्स सेंसरी इंफॉर्मेशन का किस तरह से इस्तेमाल करते हैं, ये अभी भी एक ओपन फ्रंटियर है। लेकिन सबसे बड़ा सच ये है कि एक यूनिवर्सल और कॉम्प्लेक्स ह्यूमन नेचर सच में एग्जिस्ट करती है, जिसमें कई तरह के इनहेरेंट इमोशंस, कम्युनिकेट करने की ड्राइव्स और रीजनिंग फैकल्टीज शामिल हैं जो इवोल्यूशनरी प्रेशर्स द्वारा शेप किए गए हैं। इसके बावजूद कुछ साइंटिफिक डेवलपमेंट्स को बार बार स्ट्रक्चर्ड ह्यूमन नेचर के खिलाफ एक अल्टीमेट प्रूफ के रूप में पेश किया जाता है। 3 ऐसे डेवलपमेंट्स ब्लैंक स्लेट के कॉन्सेप्ट के आखिरी बचाव के रूप में सामने आते हैं। पहला ह्यूमन जीनोम की सीक्वेंसिंग से निकल कर आता है, जब साइंटिस्ट ने यह बताया कि इंसानों में लगभग 34,000 जीन्स होते हैं, जो कि एक्सपेक्टेड होमो 1000 से बहुत कम है। तो कुछ कमेंटेटर्स ने टूरेंट बायोलॉजिकल डिटर्मिनिज्म की मौत का ऐलान कर दिया। उन्होंने आर्ग्यू किया कि इतना छोटा जेनेटिक मैनुअल ह्यूमन बिहेवियर की इतनी बड़ी कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी को हार्डवायर नहीं कर सकता और इसलिए एनवायरनमेंट ही हमारी किस्मत का सबसे बड़ा निर्माता है। लेकिन ये निष्कर्ष जेनेटिक्स की एक बहुत बड़ी गलतफहमी पर टिका है। एक छोटे से राउंड वर्म में इंसानों के मुकाबले आधे से ज्यादा जीन्स होते हैं, फिर भी उसका बिहेवियर सिर्फ बेसिक रिफ्लेक्सेस तक ही सीमित होता है। कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी सिर्फ जीन्स की गिनती से नहीं आती, बल्कि उनके आपस में होने वाले कॉम्प्लेक्स इंटरैक्शंस, एक सिंगल जीन से बनने वाले मल्टीपल प्रोटीन्स और डीएनए के उन वास्ट नॉन कोडिंग रीजन से आती हैं जो जीन एक्सप्रेशन को कंट्रोल करते हैं। हमारे साइज का एक जीनोम एक बेहद सोफिस्टिकेटेड और स्ट्रक्चर्ड ब्रेन बनाने में पूरी तरह सक्षम है। रेजिस्टेंस का दूसरा हिस्सा कंप्यूटर साइंस, खासकर कनेक्शनिज्म नाम की एक मूवमेंट से निकलता है। ये अप्रोच कॉग्निटिव प्रोसेसेस को मॉडल करने के लिए आर्टिफिशियल न्यूरल नेटवर्क्स का इस्तेमाल करती है। इन सिमुलेशंस में न्यूरॉन्स एक दूसरे को सिग्नल्स भेजते हैं और डेटा में मिलने वाले पैटर्न्स के हिसाब से अपने कनेक्शंस की स्ट्रेंथ को एडजस्ट करते हैं। इसके सपोर्टर्स का मानना है कि इन जेनेरिक नेटवर्क्स को अगर एनवायरनमेंट में सही ट्रेनिंग दी जाए तो ये बिना किसी स्पेशलाइज्ड या इनेट मेंटल मॉड्यूल्स के ह्यूमन इंटेलिजेंस की पूरी कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी को समझ सकते हैं। हालांकि ये मॉडल्स स्टैटिस्टिकल एसोसिएशंस और फजी जनरलाइजेशंस को पहचानने में बहुत अच्छे हैं, लेकिन जब इंसानी सोच के लॉजिकल रिगर्स की बात आती है तो ये बुरी तरह फेल हो जाते हैं। इंसानी दिमाग बिना किसी मेहनत के स्पेसिफिक इंडिविजुअल्स और एब्स्ट्रैक्ट कैटेगरीज के बीच का फर्क समझ लेता है, कॉम्प्लेक्स एम्बेडेड बातों को समझता है और ऐसे ग्रामेटिकल रूल्स को नेविगेट करता है जिसे एक सिंपल एसोसिएशन का वेब रेप्लिकेट नहीं कर सकता। इन हायर ऑर्डर प्रॉब्लम्स को सॉल्व करने के लिए कनेक्शनिस्ट मॉडल्स को उनके ह्यूमन प्रोग्रामर्स द्वारा हेविली कस्टमाइज करना पड़ता है, जो इफेक्टिवली इनेट स्ट्रक्चर को पिछले दरवाजे से सिस्टम में वापस ले आता है। तीसरा चैलेंज न्यूरल प्लास्टिसिटी की फैसिनेटिंग स्टडी से आता है। न्यूरोसाइंस ने यह दिखाया है कि जब दिमाग कुछ सीखता है और सेंसरी इनपुट के हिसाब से अडेप्ट करता है तो उसमें फिजिकल चेंजेस आते हैं। सेंसरी डेप्रिवेशन या न्यूरोलॉजिकल ट्रॉमा के केसेस में कॉर्टिकल रीजन्स जो आमतौर पर एक फंक्शन के लिए होते हैं, कभी कभी दूसरे काम के लिए इस्तेमाल होने लगते हैं। कुछ थियोरिस्ट्स ने इस फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी को पकड़कर यह आर्ग्यू किया है कि सेरेब्रल कॉर्टेक्स असल में एक फॉर्मलेस क्ले की तरह है जिसे एनवायरनमेंट पूरी तरह से शेप करता है। लेकिन ये लर्निंग के मैकेनिज्म को इनेट आर्किटेक्चर की कमी के साथ मिलाने जैसी गलती है। कोई भी ऑर्गेनिज्म जो सीखने के काबिल है, उसके पास एक फिजिकल ब्रेन होना चाहिए जो एक्सपीरियंस के साथ पढ़ ले। ये एक लॉजिकल जरूरत है, न कि कोई ऐसी खोज जो ह्यूमन नेचर को ही खत्म कर दे। ब्रेन की खुद को रीऑर्गेनाइज करने की काबिलियत स्ट्रिक्ट जेनेटिक और डेवलपमेंटल पैरामीटर्स के अंदर काम करती है। ये न्यूरोबायोलॉजिकल एडजस्टमेंट्स असल मी लर्निंग की इंप्लीमेंटेशन है, जो एक पहले से ही डीपली ऑर्गेनाइज्ड मेंटल फ्रेमवर्क को ट्यून करने वाले प्रिसाइज टूल्स की तरह काम करते हैं, न कि किसी बाउंडलेस और अनप्रोग्राम्ड वॉइड का सबूत देते हैं। चैप्टर 6 पॉलिटिकल साइंटिस्ट्स। ह्यूमन बिहेवियर की बायोलॉजिकल अंडरस्टैंडिंग का विरोध सिर्फ जेनेटिक्स और न्यूरल नेटवर्क्स पर एकेडमिक डिबेट्स तक ही सीमित नहीं है। ये लेट 20th सेंचुरी के पॉलिटिकल अपहीवल्स के साथ गहराई से जुड़ा हुआ है। 1970-1970s के दौरान, जो कि एक भयंकर रेडिकलिज्म का दौर था, जिन साइंटिस्ट्स ने माइंड के एवोल्यूशनरी और बायोलॉजिकल रूट्स पर रिसर्च की, उन्हें एक हॉस्टाइल आइडियोलॉजिकल वॉर का सामना करना पड़ा। यह कहना कि इंसानों की एक इनेट नेचर होती है अब सिर्फ एक साइंटिफिक हाइपोथेसिस नहीं माना जाता था, बल्कि इसे एक रिएक्शनरी पॉलिटिकल वेपन के रूप में देखा जाने लगा, जिसका मकसद इनइक्वालिटी को जस्टिफाई करना और ऑप्रेसिव स्टेटस क्वो को बनाए रखना था। इस वॉलेटाइल माहौल ने स्कॉलरली डिस्कोर्स को एक मॉरलिस्टिक थिएटर में बदल दिया। इंटेलिजेंस की हेरिटेबिलिटी पर रिसर्च करने वाले रिसर्चर्स को पब्लिक डिफेमेशन, कैंसल्ड लेक्चर्स और यहां तक कि फिजिकल थ्रेट्स का सामना करना पड़ा, क्योंकि एक्टिविस्ट्स ने उनकी फाइंडिंग्स को रेसिज्म और फैशिज्म के साथ जोड़ दिया। यहां तक कि ये यूनिफाइंग डिस्कवरी की सभी कल्चर्स के इंसानों में बेसिक इमोशंस के लिए इनेट फेशियल एक्सप्रेशंस होते हैं, यूज भी गुस्से के साथ देखा गया, और कुछ लोगों ने इसे एक ऐसी शर्मनाक बात कहा जो कल्चरल ऑटोनॉमी की अहमियत को कम करती है। इसके पीछे बेसिक डोगमा ये था कि ह्यूमन बिहेवियर के किसी भी बायोलॉजिकल फाउंडेशन को मानना हिस्ट्री के सबसे भयानक अत्याचारों का समर्थन करने के बराबर था। ये कॉन्फ्लिक्ट तब अपने एक्सट्रीम पर पहुंच गया जब सोशियोबायोलॉजी और एवोल्यूशनरी थ्योरी पर कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव वर्क्स पब्लिश हुए। इन किताबों में यह प्रस्ताव रखा गया कि सोशल बिहेवियर्स जैसे अल्ट्रुइज्म, कम्युनिकेशन, एग्रेशन और मेटिंग स्ट्रैटेजीज नेचुरल सिलेक्शन के प्रेशर्स द्वारा शेप हुए हैं। होमोसेपियंस को एनिमल किंगडम के एवोल्यूशनरी कंटिन्यूम में फर्मली रखने पर इन स्कॉलर्स ने निंदा की एक आग भड़का दी। रेडिकल साइंटिस्ट के एक वोकल ग्रुप ने इन आइडियाज के खिलाफ एक कोऑर्डिनेटेड कैंपेन चलाया और इन रिसर्चर्स को वल्गर डिटर्मिनिस्ट्स और रिडक्शनिस्ट्स का नाम दिया। उन्होंने ऐसे मैनिफेस्टोस पब्लिश किए जिन्होंने बिहेवियर की एवोल्यूशनरी स्टडी को यूजेनिक्स, डिस्क्रिमिनेटरी इमिग्रेशन पॉलिसीज और नाजी जर्मनी की जेनोसाइडल हॉरर्स के साथ जोड़ दिया। ये अटैक्स आमतौर पर बहुत गलत मिसरिप्रेजेंटेशंस पर आधारित थे। क्रिटिक्स ने एवोल्यूशनरी इंक्लिनेशन के कॉन्सेप्ट को एक रिजिड और इनएस्केपेबल कंपल्शन के साथ मिला दिया। उन्होंने आर्ग्यू किया कि अगर किसी बिहेवियर का कोई एवोल्यूशनरी रैशनल है तो यूज साइंटिस्ट द्वारा जस्टिफाई या लेजिटिमेट किया जा रहा है। उन्होंने सोशियोबायोलॉजी के सपोर्टर्स पर यह आरोप लगाया कि वो मानते हैं कि लोग जेनेटिकली प्रीऑर्डेन्ड रोल्स में बुरी तरह फेज हुए हैं, और उन्होंने साइंटिस्ट की उन एक्सप्लिसिट राइटिंग्स को इग्नोर कर दिया जो ह्यूमन सोसाइटीज की इमेंस फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी और कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी को हाईलाइट करती थी। रिडक्शनिज्म वर्ड का इस्तेमाल एक इंटेलेक्चुअल गाली के रूप में किया गया, जिसने कॉम्प्लेक्स फिनोमेना को उनके कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट पार्ट्स को एग्जामिन करके समझने की साइंटिफिक कोशिश को गलत तरह से पेश किया। इस कोऑर्डिनेटेड हॉस्टिलिटी का इंटेलेक्चुअल लाइफ पर एक चिलिंग इफेक्ट पड़ा। इसने एक ऐसा माहौल बनाया जहां साइंटिफिक डेटा की ऑब्जेक्टिव इवैल्यूएशन को पॉलिटिकल प्योरिटी टेस्ट्स के नीचे दबा दिया गया। इस नैरेटिव को अग्रेसिवली पुश करके कि एक स्ट्रक्चर्ड ह्यूमन नेचर इनहेरेंटली ऑपरेशन से जुड़ी हुई है, क्रिटिक्स ने लेजिटिमेट साइंटिफिक इंक्वायरी को स्टिग्मेटाइज करने में सक्सेस हासिल की। लेकिन जैसे जैसे वक्त बीता है, इस रेडिकल मूवमेंट की एम्पिरिकल प्रेडिक्शंस ज्यादातर गलत साबित हुई हैं, जबकि इवोल्यूशनरी और बायोलॉजिकल साइंसेस का विकास हुआ है जिसने ह्यूमन कंडीशन के बारे में प्रोफाउंड और नई इंसाइट्स दी हैं। इस दौर की लेगेसी इस बात का एक कड़ी याद दिलाती है कि जब साइंटिफिक एक्सप्लोरेशन पर पॉलिटिकल फियर और मॉरल ग्रैंडस्टैंडिंग हावी हो जाती है तो कितने खतरे पैदा होते हैं। Chapter 7. The Holy Trinity. Behavioral science is an arduous and often treacherous undertaking. Researchers in this field frequently find themselves the targets of public outrage simply for uncovering inconvenient truths about human behavior. Whether the topic is daycare, sexual habits, or even something as seemingly innocuous as left-handedness, scientists who publish data that challenge prevailing dogmas often face vilification and harassment. This fierce resistance prompts a critical question. Is this hostility merely the result of people taking offense at uncomfortable facts? Or is it part of a broader, systematic intellectual campaign to protect the blank slate, the noble savage, and the ghost in the machine? The most vocal critics of the biological sciences of human nature, particularly the radical scientists of the late 20th century, vehemently deny that they believe in a blank slate. Yet a closer examination of their arguments reveals a profound commitment to this very doctrine. They concede that biology plays a role in basic physiological functions like eating and sleeping, but they insist that the brain is predisposed to absolutely no specific social behaviors. To them, the mind has a biological potentiality to acquire any behavior, but it is not naturally inclined toward any particular one. This is simply the blank slate under a different name. The only significant contribution they grant to human genes is the physical size of our bodies and the vast number of connections in our brains, completely dismissing the possibility that these genetic instructions might also wire the brain with specialized faculties for language, emotion, and social reasoning. This extreme empiricism is deeply intertwined with political ideology. For many radical thinkers, acknowledging any innate human nature is viewed as an obstacle to social evolution and revolutionary change. The vision of humans as highly malleable raw material was famously embraced by Marxist regimes, which sought to manufacture a new kind of human being. History has tragically shown that the belief in infinite human malleability, coupled with a utopian ideology of class struggle, can justify totalitarian control and horrific mass murder just as readily as the biological determinism of the Nazis justified their genocidal racial policies. Both ideologies shared a dangerous conviction that humanity could and should be radically reshaped, and that violence was a necessary tool to achieve this perfection. The defense of the noble savage is pursued with equal fervor. Critics of evolutionary biology have consistently attacked any suggestion that prehistoric human societies were familiar with violence and warfare. They concoct statistics to argue that humans are overwhelmingly kind and that murderous incidents are negligible anomalies. Even in the face of extensive anthropological evidence showing that violent conflict was a pervasive reality for our ancestors, these intellectuals cling to the romantic image of peaceable natives. They fear that admitting a human predisposition for violence somehow excuses aggression or undermines the moral imperative to seek peace. In doing so, they elevate a factual delusion over a realistic understanding of our species' complex capacity for both great cruelty and profound cooperation. 8. The fear of inequality. The enduring moral appeal of the blank slate rests on a simple, seductive mathematical equation: 0 equals 0. If all human minds begin as entirely blank surfaces, then it logically follows that everyone is perfectly equal. However, if the slate is not blank, but instead comes inscribed with innate traits, the possibility arises that individuals, sexes, and different groups might be born with different abilities and inclinations. For many, this prospect is terrifying because it seems to open the door to three great evils. The first is prejudice, the fear that if groups differ biologically, discrimination against some groups might be deemed rational. The second is social Darwinism, the fear that innate differences in talents could be used to justify vast social inequalities and blame the poor for their predicament. The third is eugenics, the terrifying specter that society might attempt to engineer a better human race through selective breeding or the extermination of those deemed biologically inferior. To build a firewall against these horrors, many intellectuals have decided that it is safer to declare that innate differences simply do not exist. But this is a fragile and dangerous strategy. It holds fundamental moral principles like equality and human rights, hostage to a biological conjecture that could be overturned by the next scientific discovery. If we base our commitment to equality on the assumption that everyone is biologically indistinguishable, what happens when geneticists prove that we are not? Moral values must rest on a more secure foundation than the hope that the blank slate is factually true. The biological reality is that while we all share a universal human nature, the same basic architecture of cognitive and emotional faculties, we are not clones. Because of the mechanics of sexual reproduction and genetic mutation, every individual inherits a unique genetic profile. This genetic variation ensures that people will naturally differ in their temperaments, talents, and vulnerabilities. However, recognizing this biological variation does not require us to abandon the principle of equality. Equality is not the empirical claim that all groups of humans are interchangeable. It is the core moral principle that individuals should not be judged or constrained by the average properties of their group. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he was not making a scientific claim about human cloning. He was making a political declaration about rights. He meant that all people have an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of their individual physical or intellectual endowments. Acknowledging that people are born with different innate potentials does not justify treating them differently under the law or denying them fundamental opportunities. A just society can recognize the biological reality of individual differences while remaining fiercely committed to the moral imperative of equal rights and human dignity. Chapter 9. The Fear of Imperfectibility. The prospect of an innate human nature carries with it the unsettling implication that human beings might be inherently flawed. If our minds are not blank slates waiting to be inscribed with perfect virtue, but instead harbor deep-seated evolutionary drives for selfishness, nepotism, and dominance, then the dream of creating a utopian society seems permanently out of reach. This is the fear of imperfectibility, the dread that acknowledging our biological legacy condemns humanity to eternal conflict and suffering, rendering all efforts at profound social reform utterly futile. For those who envision a future where all greed and violence have been conditioned out of the human spirit, the biological perspective is not just depressing, it is an ideological threat that must be actively resisted. However, the belief that acknowledging human flaws paralyzes social progress is a profound misconception. History demonstrates that the most disastrous political experiments of the 20th century were driven by the exact opposite belief, the utopian conviction that human nature could be entirely remade. When totalitarian regimes attempted to forge a fundamentally new type of citizen, they inevitably resorted to extreme coercion, re-education camps, and mass extermination to force reality to fit their blank slate ideology. The assumption that the mind is infinitely malleable provides a chilling justification for those in power to reshape society by any means necessary, viewing individuals merely as raw material for their grand social architectures. In contrast, the most successful and enduring social systems are those that realistically account for the imperfections of human nature. Democratic institutions with their intricate systems of checks and balances were explicitly designed by thinkers who understood that humans are naturally prone to the abuse of power. By anticipating our inherent selfishness and ambition, these systems harness human nature rather than attempting to eradicate it, deliberately pitting ambition against ambition to protect collective liberty. Recognizing our biological limits does not extinguish the hope for a better world. Instead, it redirects our efforts away from the impossible task of changing human nature itself and toward the practical necessity of improving human institutions, creating laws and norms that guide our innate drives toward cooperative and peaceful outcomes. Chapter 10. The Fear of Determinism. A deep-seated anxiety accompanies the scientific exploration of the brain and genome. The fear that if our actions are rooted in biological mechanisms, then free will is an illusion and moral responsibility is obsolete. This is the fear of determinism, often expressed as the worry that understanding the physiological or genetic causes of a behavior equates to excusing it. If a person's propensity for violence or addiction can be traced back to specific neurochemical imbalances or genetic predispositions, the concern is that they can simply claim biological compulsion, effectively shielding themselves from all accountability. This apprehension leads many to vehemently reject the biological sciences, clinging instead to the notion of an uncaused, immaterial soul, the ghost in the machine, as the only way to preserve human agency and moral order. Yet the perceived threat of biological determinism relies on a flawed understanding of what moral responsibility actually entails. To explain a behavior is not to excuse it. The purpose of holding individuals responsible for their actions is not to satisfy a mystical scale of justice based on an uncaused free will, but to practically influence future behavior. Human brains, however deeply influenced they may be by genetics or evolutionary history, are also equipped with complex neural circuitry designed to anticipate consequences, comprehend social norms, and weigh the costs of actions. When society imposes penalties for harmful behavior, it provides crucial input to this intricate decision-making circuitry. Acknowledging that a biological impulse exists does not mean that the impulse is entirely irresistible, nor does it imply that the cognitive systems responsible for self-control are inactive. Even if behavior is the product of a physical brain operating according to the laws of cause and effect, the threat of social sanction remains a vital, effective, and necessary cause within that chain. Therefore, abandoning the mystical concept of an immaterial soul does not plunge society into moral chaos. It merely grounds the practice of holding people accountable in the realistic physical mechanics of how the human mind actually processes social rules, rewards, and punishments. Chapter 11. The Fear of Nihilism. The apprehension surrounding the biological sciences extends beyond the realms of equality and social progress. It strikes at the very core of human existence, awakening a profound fear of nihilism. If the human mind is fundamentally a survival machine engineered by the blind process of natural selection, a terrifying void seems to open up, threatening to consume all meaning, purpose, and morality. The worry is that if our deepest loves, our highest aspirations, and our most selfless acts are ultimately just biological strategies designed to propagate our genetic material, then everything we hold sacred is reduced to a cynical evolutionary illusion. This perspective seemingly strips the universe of any grand design and leaves individuals as mere pawns in a microscopic genetic game. However, this existential despair stems from a fundamental confusion between the differing levels of biological explanation, the distinction between ultimate and proximate causation. The ultimate cause of our behavior, the reason our traits evolved over millions of years, is indeed the cold, calculating logic of genetic replication. The metaphor of the selfish gene accurately describes the evolutionary process at a molecular level. But genes themselves are unconscious molecules. They do not possess desires, malice, or foresight. More importantly, the ultimate evolutionary rationale of a gene is entirely separate from the proximate psychological motivations of the human being it helped to build. The evolutionary process may be selfish in its mechanisms, but it has engineered a human brain capable of genuine, unselfish love, profound empathy, and authentic moral reasoning. The fact that our capacity for love evolved because it once helped our ancestors keep their offspring alive does not make the experience of love any less real or profound today. Meaning and purpose do not require a mystical origin or an external cosmic mandate. They are generated internally by the complex, evolved architecture of the human mind. Furthermore, humans are not helpless slaves to their biological imperatives. Because natural selection endowed us with an immense cognitive capacity and the ability to foresee consequences, we possess the extraordinary power to rebel against the dictates of our own genes. Every time an individual chooses to use contraception, to adopt an unrelated child, or to sacrifice their reproductive success for a higher ideal, they are asserting human purpose over biological destiny. The biological reality of our origins does not necessitate a descent into nihilism. Rather, it empowers us to define our own meaning with the magnificent brains that nature has provided. Chapter 12. In Touch with Reality. Transitioning from the defensive battles over the existence of human nature, a more profound exploration begins into the actual mechanics of the mind. To truly know ourselves is to understand how we navigate the physical and conceptual universe. A fundamental question arises: if the mind is an evolved organ, how can we trust that our perceptions of reality are accurate? Some philosophical traditions argue that humans are forever trapped within the subjective prisons of their own minds, entirely detached from objective truth. Yet, an evolutionary perspective reveals that our cognitive faculties were forged by the unforgiving demands of survival. An organism whose brain systematically hallucinated or generated entirely false maps of its environment would rapidly succumb to predators or starvation. We are in touch with reality because natural selection brutally eliminates biological systems that are chronically out of touch with the physical world. This connection to reality is facilitated by specialized mental modules, often described as intuitive sciences, which develop naturally in all human beings. From infancy, humans demonstrate an intuitive physics. we expect objects to be solid, to fall when dropped, and to persist even when out of sight. We do not learn these basic physical laws through rigorous scientific observation. They are built-in assumptions that allow us to interact seamlessly with our environment. Similarly, we possess an intuitive biology, an innate tendency to categorize the natural world into distinct species of flora and fauna, recognizing that living things are animated by internal, invisible essences that dictate their growth and behavior. This biological intuition allowed our ancestors to safely forage, hunt, and navigate complex ecosystems. However, this evolutionary legacy also explains our profound cognitive limitations and the vulnerability of human reasoning. Our minds were calibrated to solve the specific practical problems of a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer existence, not to unravel the mysteries of quantum mechanics, macroeconomics, or complex statistical probabilities. The cognitive heuristics that served us perfectly well in small, tight-knit tribal environments often misfire spectacularly in the modern, globalized world. We rely heavily on stereotypes, struggle to comprehend vast numerical scales, and frequently confuse correlation with causation. Acknowledging that our cognitive toolkit was designed for a very different world provides a crucial lens for understanding our irrationalities and optical illusions. It demonstrates that our minds are incredibly powerful and exquisitely adapted, yet inherently fallible when pushed beyond the boundaries of their evolutionary design. Chapter 13. Out of Our Depths. A profound source of human struggle arises from the disconnect between the ancestral environments that shaped our cognitive faculties and the modern world we currently inhabit. Just as our physical bodies are maladapted to a sedentary lifestyle overflowing with high-calorie foods, our minds frequently misinterpret the complexities of contemporary reality. The human intellect is not a single, all-purpose calculating machine perfectly attuned to universal truths. Instead, it is a collection of distinct cognitive modules, each meticulously evolved to navigate specific challenges of a prehistoric existence. We possess an intuitive physics to comprehend the movement of rocks and spears, an intuitive biology to categorize flora and fauna, an intuitive engineering to craft tools, and an intuitive psychology to decipher the intentions of our fellow tribesmen. While these mental tools were essential for surviving the Pleistocene, they routinely lead us astray when confronted with the abstract discoveries of modern science and the intricate structures of global societies. Our intuitive physics, for example, expects objects to follow continuous paths and possess absolute properties, rendering the bizarre, probabilistic realities of quantum mechanics and relativity almost incomprehensible. We naturally assume that space and time are absolute, making the concept of a curved universe or a dimension without time profoundly dizzying. Similarly, our intuitive biology relies on a belief in hidden, immutable essences. We instinctively feel that a plant or animal contains a mystical core that defines its nature, which explains the widespread, irrational fear of genetically modified foods. Despite the fact that agriculture has relied on selective genetic alteration for millennia, the modern technique of splicing genes violates our ancient intuition that the fundamental essence of a living thing is being unnaturally corrupted. This essentialist thinking also fuels our resistance to the theory of evolution. Our intuitive engineering module demands that any complex functional design must be the deliberate handiwork of a conscious creator. The idea that the intricate machinery of the eye or the brain could arise from the blind, purposeless process of natural selection working over unimaginable eons feels deeply counterintuitive. Furthermore, our intuitive psychology naturally separates the physical world from the mental world, leaving us predisposed to mind-body dualism. We struggle to accept that consciousness, decision-making, and the self are the results of electrochemical activity in the brain, preferring the comforting illusion of an immaterial soul. Our cognitive limitations extend into the social and economic realms as well. Humans evolved to engage in reciprocal altruism, exchanging tangible goods and favors within small, tight-knit communities. Consequently, our intuitive economics struggles to grasp the value created by modern financial systems. Middlemen, lenders, and investors do not produce physical objects by the sweat of their brow, so their contributions often feel like parasitic skimming. This failure of intuition has led to tragic historical consequences, as societies repeatedly scapegoat and persecute merchant minorities, viewing their abstract economic functions as inherently deceitful. Furthermore, our minds are notoriously bad at computing complex probabilities and statistics, favoring vivid anecdotes and recent events over accurate base rates. To overcome these deep-seated illusions, we must rely on the open-ended, combinatorial power of human rationality. Through rigorous education and the conscious application of science, economics, and mathematics, we can stand back from our immediate instincts and build higher-order strategies to comprehend a world that has vastly outgrown the African savanna. Chapter 14. The Many Roots of Our Suffering. The evolutionary logic that explains the emergence of human cooperation and love also exposes the inevitable fault lines of conflict embedded within our deepest relationships. While social psychology has long catalogued human interactions, it was the application of evolutionary biology that finally provided a rigorous foundation for understanding the tragedy inherent in the human condition. Natural selection is a relentlessly competitive process, and organisms are designed to act as survival machines for the genes that built them. While this amoral mechanism can give rise to profound altruism, it dictates that this generosity is never perfectly aligned between any two individuals. Because each person, with the exception of identical twins, possesses a unique genetic profile, their ultimate biological interests will eventually diverge. This divergence means that every relationship, no matter how intimate or devoted, contains the seeds of discord. The most startling application of this logic is found within the family. Parents and children share half of their varying genes, which creates a powerful evolutionary incentive for profound, sacrificial love. However, the genetic overlap is only 50%, not 100%. From the parent's biological perspective, all offspring represent an equal genetic investment, meaning resources should ideally be distributed to maximize the survival of the entire brood. From the individual child's perspective, they share all their genes with themselves but only half with their siblings. Consequently, the child's evolutionary imperative is to demand more than their fair share of parental resources. This invisible calculus manifests in the fierce realities of sibling rivalry, the struggles of weaning, and the profound exhaustion of parenting. The family is not a naturally harmonious unit corrupted by society, but a battleground of overlapping yet competing biological agendas. The arena of romantic love and marriage is similarly fraught. Men and women require different minimal biological investments to reproduce, which historically dictated divergent evolutionary strategies. These distinct strategies forged different psychological priorities regarding sexual variety, emotional commitment, and the allocation of resources. While companionate love evolves to align the interests of spouses rearing shared children, the threat of infidelity and the specter of abandonment constantly hover over the relationship, fueled by the differing reproductive payoffs available to males and females. Beyond the family, the relationships we forge with friends and neighbors are governed by the delicate mathematics of reciprocal altruism. Friendship relies on a system of mutual benefit, underpinned by moral emotions like sympathy, gratitude, and loyalty. Yet, the persistent temptation to cheat, to reap the benefits of another's generosity without paying the cost of returning it, necessitates a countersuite of aggressive emotions. Righteous anger, a thirst for revenge, and the desire to punish transgressors are indispensable components of the cooperative mind, designed to deter exploitation. This dynamic explains the fragility of alliances and the ease with which human interactions can descend into bitter vendettas. Perhaps the most haunting conflict, however, is the one that occurs within the individual. The survival advantage of deception in a competitive world places a premium on the ability to detect lies. Because nervous sweating, shifting eyes, and contradictions can betray a liar, the most effective way to deceive another person is to genuinely believe the falsehood oneself. Therefore, natural selection favored the capacity for self-deception. The human mind is remarkably adept at concealing its own selfish motives, repressing inconvenient facts, and fabricating rationalizations that present the individual as a highly competent, altruistic actor. We relentlessly overrate our own generosity, blame our failures on circumstance, and judge our opponents with harsh moralism while extending endless leniency to ourselves. This inherent blindness to our own flaws complicates the quest for truth and moral progress, revealing that human suffering is not merely inflicted by a cruel environment or a corrupt society, but is woven into the very fabric of our evolved nature. Chapter 15. The Sanctimonious Animal. The human capacity for morality is often viewed as the ultimate triumph of culture over biology, a set of learned rules that elevate us above the beasts. However, the moral sense is not a recent cultural invention. It is a profound biological adaptation, deeply rooted in the evolutionary history of our species. The emotions that govern our moral judgments, sympathy, anger, gratitude, guilt, and shame, were forged by natural selection to navigate the complex social dynamics of reciprocal altruism and group cohesion. Sympathy prompts us to help those in need. Gratitude ensures we repay favors, and guilt prevents us from damaging vital relationships. Righteous anger serves as a necessary deterrent against free-riders and cheaters. This evolutionary perspective reveals that morality is not a system of abstract, ethereal truths, but a suite of psychological gadgets designed to manage the delicate balance of cooperation and competition. Yet, this biological origin also exposes the dark side of our moral psychology. Because the moral sense evolved to solve practical survival problems rather than to discover universal justice, it is heavily prone to cognitive illusions and self-serving biases. The human mind is remarkably adept at moralizing its own self-interest. We instinctively frame our personal preferences and group loyalties as universal moral imperatives, turning everyday disagreements into holy wars. This sanctimony is incredibly dangerous. When people believe they are fighting for absolute moral purity, they can justify horrific acts of violence, cruelty, and oppression against those they deem evil. The most catastrophic atrocities in history were not committed by sociopaths acting out of pure malice, but by fiercely moralistic individuals who were absolutely convinced of their own righteousness. Furthermore, our moral sphere is surprisingly flexible, often expanding or contracting based on social context and evolutionary logic. Historically, the circle of moral consideration was strictly limited to one's own kin and tribe, while outsiders were viewed as subhuman and treated with brutal indifference. Over centuries, through the mechanisms of trade, literacy, and reason, this moral circle has gradually expanded to include other races, both sexes, and even other species. However, the underlying machinery of moral categorization remains intact. We still possess an innate readiness to divide the world into the righteous us and the polluted them. Recognizing the biological machinery of our sanctimonious nature does not destroy morality. Rather, it forces us to rely on higher-order reasoning and objective legal systems to temper our volatile moral emotions and prevent the catastrophic consequences of self-righteousness. Chapter 16. Politics. The debate over human nature is not merely an academic exercise. It is the hidden fault line beneath modern political discourse. Every political ideology is ultimately founded upon a theory of human nature, an implicit assumption about what drives human behavior and what kinds of societies are possible. This fundamental divide can be categorized into two competing visions, the utopian vision and the tragic vision. The utopian vision, deeply intertwined with the doctrines of the blank slate and the noble savage, posits that human nature is infinitely malleable and inherently good. In this view, social problems such as poverty, crime, and war are not inevitable features of the human condition, but the tragic results of corrupt institutions, bad traditions, and unequal power structures. Consequently, the utopian vision believes that with sufficient political will and enlightened social engineering, humanity can be perfected, and a society of total harmony and equality can be achieved. In stark contrast stands the tragic vision, which aligns closely with the biological understanding of the mind. This perspective views human nature as inherently flawed, constrained by evolutionary drives for self-interest, nepotism, and status. According to the tragic vision, the capacity for greed and violence is permanently wired into our psychology. Therefore, social perfection is an impossible dream. Instead of attempting to remake the human soul, the tragic vision focuses on building robust institutions, traditions, and laws that acknowledge these biological constraints. It relies on the balance of power, the enforcement of property rights, and the rule of law to channel inherent selfishness towards socially beneficial outcomes, accepting that civilization is a constant, difficult effort to manage our destructive impulses. The clash between these two visions maps neatly onto the contemporary divide between the political left and right. Left-wing ideologies frequently lean upon the utopian assumption that human behavior can be fundamentally reprogrammed by altering the social environment. Right-wing ideologies generally favor the tragic assumption that society must be strictly structured to contain our darker instincts. Acknowledging the biological reality of human nature deals a severe blow to the extremes of the utopian vision, demonstrating that attempts to entirely eradicate selfishness or familial preference will inevitably require massive coercion and totalitarian control. However, the tragic vision does not necessitate a heartless, hyper-capitalist society devoid of social safety nets. A realistic politics recognizes that while perfect equality of outcome is biologically impossible and politically dangerous, the human capacity for empathy and reason allows us to design compassionate systems that mitigate suffering, provided they are built with a clear-eyed understanding of the incentives and limitations inherent in our evolutionary design. Chapter 17. Violence. Violence is frequently mischaracterized either as a primitive, irrational urge or as a pathology inflicted by a corrupted culture. However, an evolutionary analysis reveals that violence is a biologically grounded strategy, a grimly logical means to an end within the unforgiving arena of natural selection. To understand human aggression, one must examine the Hobbesian trap, a dynamic that inevitably arises when self-interested organisms interact without a central authority. In a state of nature, individuals face the constant threat of exploitation. The preemptive strike becomes a mathematically sound survival tactic, leading to a relentless arms race of paranoia and retaliation. Aggression, therefore, is not a blind malfunction. It is deployed for specific evolutionary objectives: the acquisition of contested resources, the elimination of rivals, and the defense against perceived threats. This strategic nature of violence is profoundly evident in the anthropological record, which decisively shatters the myth of the peaceable savage. Forensic archaeology and ethnographic studies of pre-state societies document staggering rates of lethal conflict, with a substantial percentage of males dying in warfare or homicide. The violence was not an aberration, but a routine feature of life in the absence of a governing power. This grim reality underscores the necessity of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, a centralized state equipped with the monopoly on legitimate force. By outsourcing retaliation to an impartial justice system, societies dismantle the Hobbesian trap, radically reducing the incentive for preemptive violence and the endless cycles of blood feuds. Historical data confirms this transition, showing a dramatic decline in homicide rates as populations moved from stateless tribalism to consolidated, law-governed civilizations. Yet, the biological machinery of violence remains dormant within the modern mind, waiting to be triggered by specific environmental cues. The concept of reputation or honor is deeply intertwined with this machinery. In environments where the state is absent or ineffective, such as lawless frontiers, inner-city gang territories, or the geopolitical arena of nation-states, a reputation for disproportionate retaliation is the only effective deterrent against exploitation. This culture of honor forces individuals to respond violently to even trivial insults, as a failure to do so signals weakness and invites further predation. Understanding that violence is an evolved response to particular ecological and social vulnerabilities does not excuse the behavior, but it provides a critical framework for designing institutions that effectively disarm our innate triggers for aggression. Chapter 18. Gender. The discourse surrounding the differences between the sexes has become one of the most intellectually perilous battlegrounds of the modern era, heavily policed by the doctrine of the blank slate. To navigate this terrain, a crucial distinction must be drawn between equity feminism and gender feminism. Equity feminism is a profound moral imperative demanding equal rights, opportunities, and treatment under the law, regardless of sex. It is a triumphant extension of classical liberal principles. Gender feminism, conversely, is an empirical claim heavily reliant on the blank slate. It asserts that men and women are psychologically indistinguishable at birth, and that all observed behavioral, occupational, and temperamental differences are entirely the artificial constructs of a patriarchal socialization process. This insistence on psychological uniformity is fundamentally incompatible with evolutionary biology. Sexual reproduction inherently involves an asymmetry in biological investment. In mammals, the female bears the immense physiological costs of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, making her reproductive capacity a scarce and highly valuable resource. The male, producing vast quantities of mobile sperm, faces a fundamentally different evolutionary calculus where reproductive success is often limited primarily by access to mates. This discrepancy, driven by natural selection over millions of years, has forged deep psychological differences between the sexes. Males evolved intense competitive drives, a greater propensity for risk-taking, and a relentless pursuit of status and dominance, as these traits historically maximized reproductive output in a fiercely competitive arena. Females, carrying the heavy burden of parental investment, evolved to be more discerning in mate selection, prioritizing the protection of offspring and the securing of reliable resources. These evolutionary divergences manifest in statistically robust psychological and cognitive patterns. While there is massive overlap between men and women in most traits, the averages and the extremes often differ significantly. Research consistently demonstrates that men, on average, are more drawn to systems, mechanical structures, and competitive hierarchies, while women tend to exhibit a stronger interest in people, interpersonal relationships, and cooperative networks. These inclinations are not arbitrary social impositions. They are heavily influenced by prenatal exposure to hormones like testosterone, which actively organize the developing brain. Acknowledging these biological realities does not undermine the moral necessity of equity. A just society can guarantee equal rights and dismantle artificial barriers without demanding that men and women be statistical clones of one another, recognizing that true liberation involves allowing individuals to freely pursue their innate interests, even if those choices result in disproportionate outcomes across different professions and lifestyles. Chapter 19. Children. The doctrine of the blank slate has inflicted its most profound and intimate anxieties within the realm of parenting. In contemporary culture, the prevailing assumption is that children are formless clay, completely molded by the child-rearing techniques of their mothers and fathers. Every outcome, from a child's adult personality and intelligence to their neuroses and successes, is routinely attributed to how they were nurtured. This nurture assumption has generated a booming industry of parenting advice, leaving mothers and fathers crushed under the weight of an impossible responsibility, agonizing over every disciplinary decision and developmental milestone. However, the rapidly expanding field of behavioral genetics has systematically dismantled this immense cultural illusion, replacing it with a far more complex and liberating understanding of human development. The empirical data from behavioral genetics can be distilled into three fundamental laws. The first law states that all human behavioral traits are heritable. Extensive studies involving twins and adopted children consistently demonstrate that genes exert a substantial influence over intelligence, temperament, political leanings, and vulnerability to psychological disorders. The second law is even more disruptive to modern sensibilities. The effect of being raised in the same family is significantly smaller than the effect of genes. Identical twins separated at birth and raised in entirely different environments grow up to be remarkably similar in personality. Conversely, adopted siblings raised in the exact same household by the same parents grow up to be no more similar in personality than two strangers plucked at random from the population. The startling scientific reality is that the shared environment of the home, the parenting style, the socio-economic status, the neighborhood, has virtually no lasting impact on the adult personality of the child. This revelation naturally leads to the third law of behavioral genetics. A substantial portion of the variation in complex human behavioral traits is not accounted for by either genes or families. If a person's personality is approximately 50% determined by their genetics and 0% determined by their parents' child-rearing methods, what accounts for the remaining 50%? The answer does not lie in a mysterious, ethereal force, but in the powerful evolutionary dynamics of socialization. As developmental psychologist Judith Rich Harris has convincingly argued, children do not undergo socialization to become functioning adults by mimicking their parents. They do so by adapting to their peer groups. From an evolutionary standpoint, a child's ultimate goal is not to function within the artificial microcosm of the family, but to survive and thrive in the broader social arena of their generation. They instinctively tune their accents, their behaviors, and their social strategies to the culture of their peers, often actively rejecting the culture of their parents to secure their own status within their cohort. Acknowledging that parents do not possess the power to architect their children's personalities is not a declaration that parenting is irrelevant. Parents hold the immense power to determine the quality of their child's early life, to provide a home filled with love or fear, and to foster a lifelong relationship of trust or resentment. They have a moral obligation to protect, educate, and care for their offspring. However, relinquishing the illusion of total control is profoundly humanizing. It relieves parents of the devastating, unearned guilt when children stumble and checks the arrogant pride when children succeed. It recognizes that children are not empty vessels waiting to be filled, nor are they mere extensions of parental ambition. They are unique biological individuals, heavily influenced by their genetic inheritance and forged by the complex social networks of their own generation. Chapter 20. The Arts. The arts are frequently heralded as the ultimate sanctuary from human nature, a transcendent realm where culture and individual genius operate entirely free from biological constraints. For decades, the prevailing academic orthodoxy has insisted that aesthetic tastes are purely arbitrary social constructs, shifting randomly from one culture to another. However, an evolutionary perspective reveals that our capacity to create and appreciate art is deeply rooted in the universal architecture of the human mind. The aesthetic pleasure we derive from visual beauty, music, and narrative is not a cultural accident. It is the activation of psychological faculties that evolved for profound survival purposes. Evolutionary psychology illuminates the underlying logic of our aesthetic preferences. When we examine the visual arts, we find a universal human attraction to specific landscapes. Across diverse cultures, people consistently prefer natural scenes that resemble the African savanna, open grasslands scattered with trees, a visible water source, and a vantage point that offers a clear view of the horizon. We find this beautiful because our ancestors who possessed a psychological affinity for these resource-rich, safe environments survived and reproduced more successfully than those who did not. Similarly, our intense appreciation for symmetry in faces and forms is an evolutionary adaptation. In the natural world, symmetry is a reliable biological signal of genetic health, developmental stability, and resistance to disease. Our minds are hardwired to find evolutionary fitness aesthetically pleasing. Furthermore, art serves as a powerful display of human virtuosity. In the brutal calculus of sexual selection, organisms often develop extravagant, energetically costly traits, like the peacock's tail, simply to signal their immense biological fitness to potential mates. Human artistic creation, requiring vast amounts of time, intellect, and physical coordination, functions as a psychological peacock's tail. It is a dazzling display of cognitive excess that signals mastery, intelligence, and status. Throughout history, great art intuitively tapped into these innate psychological mechanisms, utilizing universal principles of harmony, proportion, and narrative tension to evoke profound emotional responses from a broad audience. Tragically, the 20th century witnessed a deliberate and catastrophic rupture in this ancient relationship between art and human nature. The movements of modernism and postmodernism, heavily influenced by the blank slate doctrine, consciously sought to sever art from its biological roots. The elite artistic establishment began to view beauty, melody, and coherent narrative as bourgeois, superficial, and politically suspect. They prioritized abstract intellectualization, deliberately producing works that were visually jarring, musically dissonant, and narratively incomprehensible. Art became an exercise in elite status signaling, a deliberate effort to shock and alienate the general public in order to demonstrate the superior, sophisticated tastes of the artistic vanguard. By denying the reality of innate human aesthetics, the modern artistic establishment isolated itself from the very emotional resonance that gives art its enduring power. Recognizing the biological foundations of art does not necessitate a return to simplistic kitsch. Rather, it offers a path to reconnect artistic creation with the deep, universal wellsprings of human perception and emotion.